Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Let Me Ask You This podcast. I am your host, Chris Del Pozo, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Chris Ewing. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So listen, I want to introduce you. You are a close friend of ours, but I want to be able to let everybody know just kind of the achievements that you've been able to accomplish. You do have your doctorates in psychology. You served in the United States Air Force. How long, by the way, were you in the military?
I spent 8 years.
8 years. Thank you for your service, by the way. You were part of the Mensa membership. So that's for anybody that doesn't know, that's for the 1% of the community that has an extremely high IQ. There's a qualification that you have to meet in order to achieve it. And Chris is part of that membership. And he also even donated his kidney, a non-directive kidney donor. And that just essentially means that he donated his kidney to anybody who needs it, not that someone was requesting it from him. So just a really honorable thing to do just on your end. So I definitely admire that. I admire a lot of the things that you've done and your accomplishments throughout your life, Chris. And I'm really excited to be able to kind of dive into this. So let's go ahead and start. So in the beginning of our podcast, I'm going to go a little bit into what you do and how your current business kind of associates with psychology. So how your day-to-day life kind of falls into psychology. So let's go ahead and let's dive in. So my first question to you is just going to be, why did you decide to join the military?
So my dad was a military. He was Air Force. So I grew up knowing that. We didn't have much money when I was graduating high school. So I chose to apply for an ROTC scholarship, which gave me the opportunity to attend a nice private school instead of just taking what I could get or accruing a bunch of student loans.
Yeah, no, that's a really smart way of doing it. So, and essentially you would say then just finances, and your father really was one that kind of pushed you towards that decision. Was it in the military when you decided that you wanted to pursue your education in psychology, or was that something that you have previously always wanted to do?
No, actually, I didn't discover psychology until 3/4 of the way through my master's program in education. I took a class called educational psychology, and then I found that I really enjoyed the subject and thought to myself, this is something that I could do and really get on board. So I immediately after graduating with my master's, I started my PhD program.
Wow, how awesome. You know, it's so funny. When I started my college career, I was going in for electrical mechanical engineering, and I absolutely had no interest or even idea for psychology. And I took intro to psych as a elective and fell in love. It's so amazing how just one class can just open your eyes so much to just being able to understand people. Is like, it's really enjoyable especially when you deal with people on a day-to-day basis every single day. I guess it would have you answered my essentially my next question, which would have been what pursued you to do your doctorate, which is going to be that education in psychology. Was there anything that you would say in that class that really piqued your interest, or was it just the whole class essentially?
So in particular, I found that a lot of the academic pursuits hinge on a combination of an interest in the course material and a great teacher. So the reason that I ended up pursuing English literature was in my bachelor's degree was because of a great teacher and class material that I had in high school in my AP class. So in this course, I had a really fantastic teacher who was really interested in the subject in psychology. And since I was already in an education degree, I figured that educational psychology would be a great focus area. If I had it to do over, I might have chosen industrial organizational psychology, since that's where a lot of my work has taken me. But that's where I ended up going.
You know, that's so funny because when I first started my master's program, I started in IO, in industrial organizational psychology. But I personally had found a lot of interest in communicating with people and trying to help couples and relationships, which is why I went down the avenue of going for therapy. But that's, as being that I personally know you, I do understand the benefits of what would come into play if you would have gotten your degree in IO psychology. But even then, your knowledge now, I think, definitely still helps, and it's very impacting. And I kind of want to dive into that a little bit. Since you have pursued your education in psychology and now that you have your doctorates in psychology, how would you say has made you view things differently since then? Like, I guess in the sense of communicating with people, communicating at work, friendships, relationships, business partnerships. How has that impacted you?
So I believe in kind of the classical liberal education model, where education is meant to grow the person, the depth and breadth, both. A doctorate is really a deep dive. It deepens your understanding. But in addition, because of the breadth of study that I did, everything from educational psychology to the cognitive affective psychology gave me a much better understanding of breadth of psychological knowledge that I may not have had because of the lack of kind of that, the many, many classes people were required to take in a psychology undergrad. So it was a lengthy process, but it's definitely something that has changed the way that I look at the world. When I wrote my book, most of it had to do with the intersection of psychology and leadership, because leadership has always been a topic that I really cared about, and my PhD informed the entire process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And especially that dissertation. It is not a joke. I imagine, I look forward to pursuing my doctorate. I know it's going to be a lot of work, but in the end, it's definitely going to be worth it. Now, I do want to ask you, so this is that we went into more of the academic realm of how it benefit you. Now, just if you could maybe give an example of maybe some type of day-to-day, something that a lot of people would run into that you think that the understanding of psychology, the understanding of how people's thought process kind of work, even though you can't necessarily rationalize everything, but I think it almost gives you a sense of more patience for individuals because you just have a better understanding of why they are thinking the way they were thinking, rather than just assuming that they are ignorant or assuming that they just don't know what they're talking about, they're dumb, anything of the sort. Has that been something that you've noticed to be very different as you've furthered your education?
Yeah, that's been a huge part of myself growing as a person, I would say. So part of the learning about psychology is the understanding that our own filters and the way that we think has to do with our inner selves. So each person's individual filter and perspective on the world is completely different. If you think of the world as a place where everyone is a player, to take Shakespeare's analogy, the world is a stage. Every person is the main character in their own story. So if you evert, if you will, yourself so that you can think outside of yourself, it's easy to see from other people's perspectives, to realize that almost nothing is about you when it comes to other people. And it's a great way to bring empathy into play in your day-to-day life, to realize that it's not that someone is trying to offend you, or that you are the butt or the brunt of any joke or anything of the sort. In most cases, no one really took you into consideration, because even though you're the center of your own universe, from a cognitive perspective, you're not the center of anybody else's universe. Even your spouse thinks about their own physical and mental reality before they start thinking about the person that they love. So just going to the grocery store, you have to know the lady who is trying to think about what she wants to put on the table that evening and whether she can afford it. If she stands in the way and of you trying to get to the checkout line, she's not being rude, she's not being ignorant, she's not thinking about you at all, or really anybody else. She's probably thinking about difficult economic times, whether or not she wants to buy X or Y product. The idea that cars are an extension of ourselves, but they dehumanize our mental processes, for example. So when you're on the road, people aren't being any more or less rude. They just aren't thinking of themselves as interacting with other people. They're thinking of themselves as interacting with non biological objects. So they're thinking of themselves as driving in cars and the other cars being rude and the people in them intentionally annoying you. And that's not at all true. In reality, they're just trying to get from point A to point B, and they're dealing with their own issues in the car as they drive. So it's trying to understand the world from a psychological perspective is it's mind bending for sure.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I think when you just take in consideration that people are going through things that maybe you have no idea or have never experienced or couldn't even imagine because it's never happened to you, doesn't mean that it's not happening to others where it affects them and it could even come out. Again, I think that's why I was emphasizing on the aspect of you have more patience for them, because even if somebody lashes out at you, when you see that there's a lot going on for that person, I think, at least personally, it's always been much easier for me to be like, I think you're just mad and you happen to just take it out on me. And that may play a factor of just my experience in customer service. I definitely think when you work jobs, customer facing jobs, that definitely has you constantly in front of people, whether they're happy, mad, or any of the sort. You learn, I guess people call it that tough skin, but I think having an understanding is different than tough skin, only because having tough skin, you don't let anything bother you. Understanding, you're not letting it bother you. You know they're going, and you honestly, like you said, you probably end up having more empathy for the person because you can see they're going through something. You may not know what it is, but you can at least see that they're going and experiencing something.
Sure.
But it is, psychology is very mind opening to how people handle and view the world. Now, I was told previously, before I started my journey, that I have to consider, when I start noticing patterns in humans, that it's very difficult to turn it off. And then it makes it very difficult for you to maintain relationships, in the sense of it's hard to not see things. I guess it wouldn't be difficult to maintain a relationship because it's up to the individual to choose to, I guess, speak if they see something that, someone behaves a certain way that doesn't necessarily coincide with what they're saying. There's an inclination to want to be like, are you sure that's how you feel? Is there maybe something else going on? And I will say, I myself have learned that even though you can't turn it off, I don't necessarily regret the decision, just because I think it is important to be able to learn how to kind of manage that view. So my question is, have you experienced it more difficult to communicate with people when you notice these patterns, these indications, or maybe some subconscious behaviors that might indicate contradictory to what they're saying?
No, I find that it typically enhances my ability to connect. I think that any categorization, if you take it with a grain of salt, if you use it to the benefit of others, it can only be beneficial. I'm not sure why categorization and breaking things down, because that's how humans interact with and make the world around them rational. One of the things that I've learned, honestly, over time is, we'll say, Hanlon's razor. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's the idea that we should never attribute to malice that which can adequately be explained by stupidity. So rather than stupidity, because it's kind of a harsh way to put things, I would just say another person's inability to think clearly and articulate their actions in concordance with their thoughts. In a lot of cases, it's just because people don't take the time to think about what they say before they say it. And that means that their actions will often be contradictory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's in a previous podcast that I had with my friend Joey, one of the things that I talked about was the fact that people are very willing to speak their mind. But they don't really take the time to really think about what they say. And then you have less individuals also just listening. People are so quick to talk that they don't stop and just kind of listen for a second. I absolutely agree. And I see what you're talking about. I guess what I was talking about was, like, for an example, with my wife, when I communicate with my wife sometimes and she says something to me, but her body's telling me something completely different. I have to find the fine line between bringing that up or allowing her to express herself the way she needs to be able to express herself, or at least the way she knows how to express herself. Have you experienced any situations with either personal relationships or business relationships or anything like that where you had found yourself that you have to be careful with not calling out or not addressing anything that you know to be misleading?
Yes. So I resonate with what you're talking about, because it becomes more dangerous. Communication becomes more dangerous, and by dangerous I mean more highly risky based on the closeness of the relationship. So if you have a close relationship, the stakes are much higher when you're communicating with that person, especially if it's in an area of potential conflict, than if you're just, say, talking to someone on the street or someone that you have a professional relationship with. One of the things that you can assess is whether or not that person is willing to collaborate with you and learn from their potential conflicting body language versus, we'll say, mind-mouth filter. I know that I've grown, for instance, with my wife. We're celebrating our 20th this next year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And that's one of the things that we've grown together, has been the opportunity to be able to say what we mean what we say, and communicate with each other in a way that reduces the any misunderstanding. So it's certainly not a perfect system. I don't think most people get there. But if at any time we have questions about, we'll say, body language, or whether or not we are in a safe emotional space, we typically are able to ask each other those types of questions. And I think that that's really where you have to be. You have to be in a learning and growth mindset. Because one thing that I think that you and everyone else who's taken psychology will understand, and anybody who's taken a conflict resolution class will understand, is that if you aren't willing to resolve the conflict, if you aren't willing to learn, then you're not going to learn. And any attempt to educate will be futile.
Yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, you can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped. And I think it's amazing how I have learned, or at least I believe, that more people learn through experience than advice. And I think the only people who truly listen to advice are people who have learned to listen to advice. I think it's important if you're having a conversation with someone, or I guess a debate, that you are communicating with someone who at least is willing to listen to what you have to say and absorb it, rather than communicating with someone who, again, if their view is completely one-sided, and if they believe that if you don't view things the same way, that you are incorrect, it's very difficult to have a conversation with someone like that of any kind.
Especially if they're unwilling to address, and if they're unwilling to address their underlying assumptions, then those assumptions color everything that they purport to know. And with regard to the advice comment, as a counselor, someone who's trained, that you can't offer advice to clients because advice imposes your ethical concerns and worldview onto the clients. Whereas I'm not a practitioner. I can advise people if I'd like. I tend not to offer advice. And the reason for that is it robs the other person of the opportunity to experience authentically potentially the suffering, but also the joy of discovery of their own ability to learn and grow. So you can say something predictive. If this happens, you're going to potentially experience this, and I'd love to talk to you about it when that happens. But if you say you should take this course of action and not this course of action, that robs that person of their agency, their personal agency, in which case they are probably going to come to resent you, which is why I carefully said my wife and I tend to learn and grow together, as opposed to my influencing her for the good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, most definitely. Because, and I think a lot of that has to do with also taking consideration that us as individuals, we are not perfect either. No matter how much we educate ourselves, we can always be wrong. A lot of it is, you have chances of things happening, but it's never 100%. And you're right. In therapy, you won't give somebody advice. The goal is for the client to come up with their own solutions, because then it gives them the tools and the capability of being able to redo that again if it comes up without a therapist. So absolutely, I agree. And as I get older and I do more of this stuff, I understand that more. I see it more. I see families all the time, parents, that they want to help their children, and they believe they're helping their children by doing things for them rather than showing the kids how to do it themselves, letting them fumble, and then they be there to help them when they fumble. And I think that is very crucial for everybody to experience and learn, not even just children. But it's amazing because we convince ourselves that we're doing it to help somebody else. But really, I think if anything, it's almost like a selfish act, because you're imposing your views as it to be correct for that person rather than allowing them to figure it out on their own.
Sure. I mean, and I think that, the humility that you mentioned as a virtue can easily be applied to adults. Sometimes it is appropriate, I think, for parents to tell their children what to do and make sure that happens, because without establishing parental boundaries, you're not fulfilling your role as a mentor and as a parent. But again, that's situation specific. I think that one of the things you said that really resonated with me was the idea that our education doesn't make us better than anyone else. And I found that to be incredibly true. It's in the same way that holding an elevated position in a company, if you will, does not make you superior to anyone else, except in job title. Surely your life experience, your growth as a mature human being, and the way that you enforce and live the ethics and virtues in your life make you a better person. I like to see and think of education as something that kindles your ability to think and to interact with the world in a healthy and elevated fashion, not necessarily something that makes you any better or worse than anyone else.
All right, Chris, I want to go ahead and jump into, so the next segment that of my podcast is, again, tying all of this stuff to therapy and how therapy can benefit people, whether they feel like they need it, they don't need it. I think it's good for everybody to understand that at some point there is some type of trauma that exists within all of us, and it's good to be able to talk through a lot of these things. Whether or not you know it's there, you'd be surprised, right? One of my misconceptions about therapy that I have here is going to be therapy is only talking, right? And that it doesn't solve real life problems. What's your view on that?
Oh, I think that's somewhat absurd. So there are various ways that you can work through trauma that don't involve therapy. Many of them rely on a conscious, evaluative effort of yourself in circumstances that some people could refer to as crucibles, where you have to go through something with a beautiful and well thought out inner self-reflection that is critical and measured, and then come out on the other side and then be able to evaluate your responses to that situation, apply it to your past. A lot of that work is exceptionally difficult without a trained person leading you through it. So yeah, can you achieve what you need to without a therapist? Yeah, it's possible, sure. I mean, and once again, however, I have to say that therapists aren't necessarily just the trained therapists in, we'll say, marriage and family therapy or whatever else. They could also be, the role can be filled by someone who is not educated in that very narrow way. It could be a priest, it could be a confidant who has emotional maturity and the ability to listen and give back. But those folks are few and far between. And if you're looking for consistency of results, it's like taking your car to someone who knows a lot about cars versus taking your car to someone who owns a Meineke and, does oil changes for a living if it needs an oil change. It's not the same thing. Would I ever discount the idea of mentorship and going to your spiritual director for something? No. But if you're talking about dealing with trauma can be pervasive, difficult. It can affect every area of your waking life, and honestly, your not waking life. I've experienced trauma in my personal life. I've been in combat in Iraq. There's a lot of things that I've dealt with in my life. Some of it required therapy, some of it did not. But yeah, that's where I stand.
I agree. Just to think that mental health would not be considered real life problems is kind of mind blowing to me. But I think a lot of people discount the will it takes to be vulnerable, the will to be able to admit that there's something wrong with you or that you have something that needs to be addressed. Nobody wants to say that there's something wrong with them. Nobody wants to admit that they've got stuff going on. And I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, and that's because the primary organ with which we view the world is our eyes. We listen to respond instead of listening to understand, because our ears, our audible sense is not as primary in the processing and functionality as our optical sense is. So if you can't see an injury, does the injury exist? And there are a lot of people who would prefer not to think that your big, beautiful brain is something that you need to have looked at every once in a while. People, and I'm not really sure why this is, I've never really understood this before or after my education, but trauma exists. Difficult situations exist. They color everything that you think and do. And it all goes back to the gray matter sitting inside your head, but people are unwilling to address it. And I know what you just said is brilliant, is that it takes courage, it takes grit, and it takes a huge amount of humility to be able to be vulnerable with someone else. And it's because these wounds are internal. It's not something that someone else can see. So you have to turn up your vulnerability while someone else turns up their empathy, so that you can, in dialogue, express what has happened, how it affects you now, and the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anybody who's willing to go down that journey, it's going to be a difficult one. And more often or not, if there was a successful journey in a sense that the therapist was able to help them figure out their problems and address them amongst themselves, that they will be a better person at the other end of it. You only move up. Addressing these things, acknowledging these things, though it may take time, right? Because obviously the longer the trauma, there's a good chance it's going to take a long time then to not necessarily undo the trauma, but at least be able to address it, acknowledge it, and live with it. And if you can learn kind of how to not allow it to dictate your life, I think that's when it then starts to show an impactful sign in people's lives.
Sure. And I think that the language we use to address mental illness or trauma, and how we go in versus how we come out on the other side, is probably part of the problem. Because we'll say you can be better. Well, what does that mean qualitatively and quantitatively? I mean, could we not say we want to be whole? We want to be made well? It's a difficult situation, because a lot of those have implications when we think about them in our minds. What we're thinking of being well is, I no longer have the flu. I no longer experience physical malady symptoms. I'm well. And if you say better than what? Better than I am? I mean, better than someone else? It's an interesting situation. I think that so much of this is tied up with language in ways that we haven't yet sussed out as a society.
I agree. I think there's specific terms that are used a lot to kind of justify things. I know we know somebody that is not a big fan of the word assume. You know, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me, right? So, and when you go out of your way to take words like that out of your vocabulary, or maybe use a different term to explain what you're trying to say, I think words are impactful. So I think if you choose the right words in the right settings, they can be very impacting to the individual. And I do agree. I think we have an issue with our language right now, that we have not really been able to establish good terminology for stuff yet.
That's true. I mean, and as you probably know, I listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson, and one of the things that strikes me the most, and that I totally agree with, is being careful in choosing the words that you use. I've let my mouth run. I've let my mouth run in the past to my detriment. Using non-clinical or non-specific language to describe things has been very difficult on my relationships and my boundaries. You know, in psychology, it's really important that we take into account not just the words we use, but how those words fall on other people's ears.
I agree, because especially when I talk to somebody who feels like they just need to say whatever's on their mind at that moment, I always ask them, what is your goal? Are you just trying to tell them what you think because you think they need to hear it? Or are you actually trying to convince them or to show them your perspective? Because I think if you're really trying to show somebody your perspective, you will be willing to adjust your words and adjust your approach to be able to be effective, rather than to be what they would consider quote unquote right. And I think that hurts a lot of people, because again, if you go into a conversation thinking you're right, that's going to be a very difficult conversation to have. But if you go into the conversation thinking, you know, I could be wrong, I think you have more of an dialogue. I think you have more of a back and forth, a respectful conversation where you can kind of openly debate perspectives and understandings that gives you an opportunity to be able to kind of think in the other person's way or perspective, I guess.
Sure. Well, I mean, and if you open up that can of worms, you can think of it in a different way rather than thinking in, we'll say, black and white or right and wrong, which is, it's obviously a not quantum. What's the other word? Binary. It's a binary relationship, right? So most things in life aren't binary. Life is messy. Life is complex. So entering a conversation, being willing to listen and learn, as opposed to being prepared to be proven wrong or right, means that rather than wrong or right, you have the opportunity to learn something that will add to your body of knowledge and potentially to you as a person. So, I don't typically think that I'm more wrong than I am right, but I also don't listen to other people so that they can prove me that wrong. I like to take their input, add it to my body of knowledge, assess it, and then see if I move forward in a different direction.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good tactic to have. I think that approach allows you to be able to just kind of measure everything and evaluate everything that's been told, that you've seen, that you've read, and then allows you to just come up with your own conclusions. And I think that is super important for people to be able to do, because sometimes people don't know how to come to their own conclusions. Unfortunately, they just like to listen to somebody else's and go along with theirs. So I do one more question for you before I let you go. I wanted to ask if you were to give somebody advice on why they should consider just having a foundational understanding of psychology. So let's say, for an example, a student's going to be going into college. Why do you think it would be beneficial for them to take a psych class? Why do you think it'd be beneficial for somebody to go see a therapist if they don't feel like they need to? What kind of advice would you give that type of person?
So those are two very different questions, I would think.
That is true. So, there's two different scenarios.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. So if I was advising an incoming college student, for example, to take a psychology course, the primary question I would ask is, who do you expect to encounter in your life, in your professional life, in your personal life? Other people, I assume, unless you plan on living in an island in the middle of the sea, all alone. So would it be beneficial to you to understand the motivations of the people around you, to be able to interact with them in a more knowledgeable and holistic way? Do you want to understand how they learn, how they think, how organizations behave on a macro level and why? Or the alternative is you continue through life figuring that out on your own without that foundational understanding. With regard to therapy, that can be more tricky because oftentimes folks are not at the point in their lives where they're able to take a step back and realize that, well, first of all, I have to say that not everybody needs therapy. Right. I think that a conversation over coffee is probably adequate for some people and good for them. Not to say they won't need it in the future. But if there's someone who probably needs therapy and they're unwilling to consider it, one of the things I would say is, what's the risk reward here? The risk for you is that you continue to suffer and unnecessarily, that you allow your intrusive thoughts and your trauma to continue to affect the way that you live your life. Or you have a conversation with a knowledgeable individual who can help you point yourself in a direction that is healing and meaningful. It's a small investment in time and it opens you up to a world of possibilities that you may not have known existed.
I absolutely agree. Chris, again, thank you so much for doing this. This has been a absolute blast. I really hope that people were able to kind of gain some of the some knowledge from this. And again, the goal is for people to understand that there is a huge benefit of just having even a basic understanding of psychology, just a basic foundation of how kind of people think, how people act. You know, you will never understand why everybody does what they do. And if you try to rationalize every decision, you will probably want to pull your hair out. But when you can go in understanding that people will always think differently than you, people grow up differently than you, people experience things differently than you, it gives you a little bit more of a patience and understanding when you are talking with them, working with them. If you're building a relationship, a friendship, whatever the case may be, you're going to experience this in any type of communication with other people. So, Chris, thank you again so much. I absolutely appreciate it. If you guys like the video, subscribe, like the channel, and if you have any questions, please comment them below. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks. Appreciate it.